and sort of evaluate, whether or not they want to work with you. And it just automatically promotes you as a developer to the extent that you want to be promoted. So you really should fill out your bio, put a picture up, place some tags, things like that. These are the guys currently on Turbo who use it very regularly. This left side column, by the way, it's indexed by activity level. So whoever's more active, they show up on top. So obviously, I'm most active. So these projects are automatically on Turbo. So what we do tonight will also be on here, and other people can look at it and see if they like your work. Now, what I'm doing, this is a project on Turbo by another person. What I'm doing is I'm promoting this amongst developers and startups. So I do equally as many workshops for startups, non-programmers. And I promote it in such a way that if they want to find a good programmer, go on here, find the guy with the right stack that you're looking for, hire him or her, give him money. And that's it. All right, so that's Turbo. That's my sales pitch on that. But you're all here to work on React, so let's get started. So open up your terminal. We need to install a couple modules, which you probably already have, but just in case, we want to install Gulp. If you already have it, it's fine, but if you don't, we're doing this. We want to install Webpack next, globally. So again, very good chance you already have this. Last but not least, you want to install the Turbo CLI. You definitely want to do this because you probably do not have this. And I'm updating this a couple times a week. Okay, and real quick, check the Turbo version number. Make sure it's this one right here, or higher. It could be 1511 if you have that. All right, Turbo, the CLI is a liaison between your local source code and your remote, your Turbo account. So kind of like your Heroku, when you deploy to Heroku, you need the CLI to do that. It's the same idea. In addition to that, the CLI also gives you a lot of scaffolding tools. So we're going to use one of the scaffolding tools on the CLI to create our React Redux project. Okay? Our React Redux project will begin with user registration and login, some basic auth stuff like that. Depending on how fast we move, I want to build a very, very simple job board where people can post a job. This is not like a real thing. We're not going to publish it or anything, but it's going to be a very simple CRUD application for creating a job and posting a job if you want to hire someone, or if you're looking for a job. So a very sort of simple app that, it's a very typical application. Just we want to post a job, you need a user auth, you need sign on, stuff like that. So let's get started with that. I'm going to do this on my desktop, but just go wherever you do your work. So let's create our app. So let's call it Job Search. So here we're creating an app called Job Search, but we're also going to use the React flag to specify that we want to create a React application. So Turbo will scaffold a full stack React Redux application by doing this. Okay, it gives you a React Redux environment right away. Okay, so go ahead and do that. Make sure you see that. Okay, you don't have to worry about this. We're going to do all this together right now. So CD into that directory. It'll create the directory, and you want to CD into it. This is a Node Express plus React Redux project. So given that, we have to run the npm install, just like any other Node Express project, really Node project. So run the install. Typically that takes about a minute. So while that's going, head over to your Turbo admin dashboard. Let me just log in. So on your dashboard, you probably see something like this. You probably see instructions on the middle panel, so don't worry about that. So over here, we want to create the corresponding project on your Turbo account. Okay, so we can call it Job Search as well. All right, just leave everything else just the way it is, and just go ahead and create that. And now we have our project created on our Turbo account. Okay, what we need right here is the app ID number. So go ahead and grab that. And that's your unique identifier for your project on Turbo. This is how we connect our local source code to our Turbo environment. Okay, so while that's going, this should be almost done. So next thing we want to do is connect our project locally to our Turbo remote, and then just confirm that that's working, and then we can begin our development process. Okay, everyone successfully registered, right? All right, so this is just about done. Node is now soliciting donations on the CLI. Maybe I should start doing that. Please give me money. Okay. Now we want to connect our app, our local source code to our projects by doing that. Okay, so you paste in your app ID just like that. And now our project is connected to our app on the remote. And last but not least, we want to do Turbo login to authenticate so that you can deploy successfully. Except put in the right password. Alrighty. Now run the dev server, Turbo dev server, which is just a localhost dev server. It's a Node Express server on 3000. So go ahead and run that. And head over to localhost 3000 and you will see the scaffolded project. So you should be seeing this. Okay, the important thing to understand here is that you are looking at a React Redux project. Okay, so this is all React Redux. It's obviously very simplified, but it's a React Redux environment as per the scaffold specification. Okay, so does everyone see this? Otherwise, nothing's going to work. Right? So make sure you see this.
After you log in, you hit hit start or run, or what'd you do?
Dev server, Turbo dev server.
Oh, Turbo.
Is there any way to change your password on Turbo 360?
Yeah. Did you not? Does not work?
Yeah, I forgot my password.
Just sign up again. Like I don't like. It's gonna take a while. Just use a different email or something like that. Alrighty, so once we confirm that that worked, that means everything is properly set up. Go ahead and open your project in your text editor, and you will see a full project right off the bat, right? This is the Node Express environment, typical, very, very standard Node Express environment, so it's very conventional. What's important to understand is that the src directory is where all the React Redux code resides, and everything beyond that is just regular Node Express. Okay, a couple standards are imposed here, like we're using the Mustache templating engine. I just prefer that one. I don't know if that's what they taught at your bootcamp, but it's just a standard templating engine. The public directories are default static directories, just very, very standard default values and standards are put in place. Okay. The src, again, is where all the React Redux code begins. So if you look at the index file inside the src, you were looking at the entry point, the React entry point, which rendered the contents that we were just looking at. So I want to do one more thing real quick, just to make sure everything works on your local as well as your remote. So head over back to your terminal and do Turbo deploy. And deployment is pretty similar to Heroku. It takes about 1 to 2 minutes, depending on the size of your project. This one probably takes about a minute. And then we want to make sure our project works on our staging environment as well as our local, so we're confident everything works on both ends, obviously. Okay? So everyone else go ahead and do this. Make sure your project works on your remote as well as your local. If you're curious from a technical standpoint, I built all this on AWS Lambda. So right now we're running our projects as a series of Lambda functions on AWS. Essentially, it's a fully serverless web stack environment. So when the deployment is up, it gives you a staging link, which you should see right there. Just copy and paste that into your browser and make sure it works. All right. And here's the main thing you want to pay attention to. You see this icon up here? That means this is a React project. This is the Chrome React plugin, the React Developer Tools plugin, which tells you whenever you're on a website that uses React, it tells you that right here. So you're looking at a React project. So it just scaffolded that for you right off the bat. Okay? Everyone with me? All right. So that means everything worked. We're now ready to begin programming. So let's get started on that. Let's rock and roll.
Excuse me.
Yep.
I pasted my link into my browser. It's
Okay. What happened with the deploy? Did you see the confirmation at the end?
successfully complete. Gave me a link and I pasted that and just have a white screen.
All right. So everything works on your local as well as remote, which means we're ready to get started programming. So if you open up the, let's see here. Let's run our dev server again, turbo dev server. And go back to localhost 3000. Let's go ahead and make sure that still works. All right, so what's important to understand is right here, this page is inside this template is inside the views directory. So if you open up the views directory right here, index.mustache is literally the HTML content you're looking at. You may recognize that this is a React entry point, right? We have our root line 6, which is where the React code is rendered, and we have our React bundles here, lines 12 and 13. I split the bundles into two. Explain that later. But this is a very typical sort of plain vanilla React entry point. Okay? What we're going to do right now is use a very conventional template to create a login registration form. That's going to be non-React to keep it simple, and that'll create our user auth right away, and then the React side will handle the logged in state. So let me just show you what I'm like. Let me be a little bit more concrete about that. If you go on Turbo and you log out, this is not a React project. See, the React thing doesn't show up. This is just regular HTML, CSS, jQuery, just normal stuff, Bootstrap. But once you log in, why do I keep doing this wrong today? There we go. All right. Now we are looking at a React Redux environment. We're looking at basically a different project because the logged in state has a lot more data. So this is actually a pretty important distinction that I don't really point out in demos, but I'm going to start doing that now. A lot of sort of beginner React Redux developers, one of the biggest mistakes they make is they sort of overreact. They put React everywhere, right? That's not really a good idea because then you're sort of tying yourself or your company or your startup to React in all parts of the stack. So for example, Turbo 360 is my startup. I've been running this for about 6 or 7 months now. If I want to hire a developer to work on the front end, and I built this whole thing in React Redux, guess what? I have to hire a React Redux developer. I kind of shot myself in the foot. You see that? But if I keep this in regular JavaScript jQuery and HTML, CSS Bootstrap, I can find a guy who can do that, or a girl, much cheaper than React Redux, right, on an hourly basis. I can find a jQuery developer at NYU for 20 bucks an hour. That's no problem. Finding that for React Redux, it's not going to happen. Just not going to happen, not in this city. I'm going to have to go overseas for that. If some guy came to me and offered me 25 bucks an hour to do React Redux, that's just a joke. Like, literally, that's a joke. I'd be like, nah.
So what you're saying is, React will give us more money?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why Full Stack made that transition. They were very smart to do that when they did. Because it's been about a year, I think, or a year and a half. Before that, I think they did Angular, mean stack, right? Yeah. So Full Stack made that transition for a good reason because React Redux is insanely high in demand right now. So, I mean, the reason I taught myself iOS 7 years ago, think about that, 7 years ago, 2010, That was at the time it was iOS 3, I think, was the main operating system. Like, can you remember 7 years ago how big the iPhone was? Like, just how much of a revolutionary product it was. I knew that this would create a new high-level demand on the iPhone development side. And I also knew as a non-programmer, having been out of college already, that I'm behind. I'm way behind. So I had to figure out a way to give myself any edge I possibly could. So the iOS programming was a calculated decision. It wasn't just like, oh, I'll learn iOS. No, it was, I can learn PHP, Rails, iOS, Android. There's so much to get into. What's a good move, right? So I picked the one that's going to have the highest demand over the next 5 years, so I'll have an easier entry point. And that worked out very well. So React Redux, it's not quite as strong, but that dynamic does exist. The separation between supply and demand is still there, and you probably have a couple more years, I would say, 12 to 24 months, where that won't reach equilibrium. The good news for you is that React Redux is quite difficult, which is a good thing. So the labor supply of that market is going to have a harder time catching up. And that buys you more time. All right, so you want to get better and better and better at React Redux. The demos I used to do for just regular like HTML, CSS, and I still do those, like very beginner demos, those aren't as nearly as challenging. Everyone keeps up. It's sort of a more relaxed pace. These demos, I'm surprised if more than half can keep up. And that's pretty much never the case. So that's why I keep saying, if you fall behind, don't worry. It's okay. It's going to be on the video section, and you can follow along that way. But that ratio has never changed. And I've been doing these demos for over a year. This is probably demo number 300 I've done. Like it's been this way for a while. All right, so just understand that the market, the labor market in technology is changing, with very strong implications in terms of how it's going to stratify. I'll get to that later. You guys are here to learn React Redux anyway, but I have a lot of thoughts on that matter. Yeah.
Just for clarity, which project is this? On the tutorial section again? What's the title?
Excuse me?
The project we're building out now, where is it? In the tutorials section, you said there's a video on it?
Oh, no. I'm recording the tutorial right now.
Oh, okay.
So the tutorial is currently being recorded.
Oh, okay.
And then when I go home, I usually just edit it, cut out some junk stuff, and then upload it. So by this time tomorrow, tonight's workshop will be on the website.
Thank you.
Where was I? Okay, so what we're going to do is create. So head over to your views directory, and we're going to create a registration form for the user, a login form. So let's just call it a sign up. Okay, so we're creating a template, a mustache template inside the views directory called sign up. Okay, so you should see this here now. Okay, the sign up mustache. Head over to your routes. This is very, very conventional, just routes in Node Express. Open up the index route. These are all sample routes, most of which we're not going to use. So get rid of all of these. We're not going to use these. We're just going to use the first one right here. That's already the one we're using on the home page route. And we're going to create another route called sign up. Okay, and this will render the sign up page like so. This will render the sign up template that we just created. And on that template is going to be literally a sign up form, username, password, or email password, as well as a login form and a logout button, things like that. Okay, so very, very standard Node Express so far. This should have been like day 1 or 2 of like most programs, so just regular Node Express. Alrighty, and then head over to your sign up mustache file. Let's copy and paste the index mustache over into that just so we get some initial content. But let's get rid of all this and let's do, I don't know, H1 sign up. Job, let's call it job search. And then let's do a div. Sign up. And we'll just do a regular form here. It's very standard form. And for now, let's go with just regular email password. Keep it simple. sign up. Okay, basically the simplest form possible, right? We have an email, password, and a button that says sign up, and this will create our user account. This should obviously, well, I don't know how obvious this is, so tell me if it's not obvious, but this should invoke a post request to an endpoint that creates the user for us, okay? So we're gonna do that next. I'm gonna create a Bootstrap class right here called container. So Turbo right out of the box gives you a lot of like standard tools. So I'm using Bootstrap classes because it's already installed. So Turbo it's all about scaffolding the conventional tools. So obviously Bootstrap is in that category, as well as jQuery, things like that. It's a very conventional stack. One thing I worked very, very hard to do with Turbo is maintain industry standard conventions so that you don't have to learn all these weird things just for Turbo, like you have to do for Firebase and Meteor, things like that. Nothing against those services, but they're fantastic. I use Firebase a lot, but Turbo's not meant to be sort of an alternative to that. It doesn't really compete with something like Firebase. It's more of a general full stack environment. Okay, so we have our form set up. Let's make sure that it's just rendering. So Turbo dev server. The route we created was sign up, right? So just let's test that route and see what happens. Okay, so that's it. Beautiful sign up form. So that's good to go. Everyone have that? I'm just going to give some background here. It's hard to see on the screen, but looks better. All right, so let's create a route whose job is to register users. Let's call it the auth route. So head over to your terminal. Before I plow ahead, is everyone good on this? All right, so head over to your terminal. Yeah, let's do the thumbs up, thumbs down method so I can see this. So cd routes, and let's create an auth route. So this is a JavaScript route, right? So auth. All right, open up the API route and just copy and paste all this in to the auth route like that, just so we have some initial content. Okay. And forms should send posts. Okay, so if you didn't know that, now you know. So what we want to do is create a post route right here, and let's call it register, like that. Okay, so our post form will send data to this endpoint right here. And then what we want to do is just, right for now, I'm just going to spit back some JSON so that I can visually confirm that this worked. So let's just send back the actual data that the post form, just send it right back to the client side. Basically, just boomerang, just send it right back, just to make sure that we visually can confirm that the data has been passed through. Okay, and inside your app.js, don't forget to actually hook up that route, right? I always forget stuff like this, little things like this. Otherwise, it won't go anywhere, right? So let's do okay, so lines 9 and 14 are the two things I just did right there. So make sure you cover that, 9 and 14. Right, so this connects our new route to the entire project. Right? Otherwise, the project won't actually know about it and it won't run. Okay. Once you have that, we have to go back to our actual sign-up form, right, and connect that route. So it sends the data to that route. So the action is going to be /auth/register, right? That's the endpoint that we just created, so we're good on that. And then the method is going to be post. whoops, excuse me. So right there on line 10 is what are the adjustments I just made. Okay, so hopefully that will send this data to that endpoint, and once we hit the endpoint, it'll just bounce it right back to us, visually confirming that everything worked. That's what's supposed to happen. Let's cross our fingers, and let's test it out. So head over to your terminal, run the dev server, turbo dev server, and let's head over to the sign up endpoint page template, and let's sign up our user. So LeBron James. And there it is. So that means it worked. We're good to go. If you don't have this plugin, it's a Chrome plugin that just formats your JSON. You can just literally Google that, JSON formatter Chrome. Take a second to plug in. Okay, you guys see this?
Could you, for a second, go back to index.js?
Sure thing. Right here? Okay, so thumbs up. Who's got it working? All right, we don't want to lose that many people too soon. So let's get this all working. So what pages do we need to see?
API.js.
Yep. Okay, right here. Now keep in mind we didn't actually do anything here. We just copied and pasted it. So we copied and pasted this into the auth.js just to get some initial content, just to get some routes right away. Which one? Auth, yep. All right, so what we've done is we've visually confirmed that the data has been passed from the client side to the back end. We confirmed that. Now let's start persisting that data. So what we're going to do is, you see on line 1 there's a Turbo reference. That is your SDK, your connection to your Turbo backend. So what we're going to do is comment this out and create a user on our Turbo project, literally call it create user, pass in the body parameters, and this returns what's called a promise, which is basically just a more easy way to handle completions. Okay, so here, inside the success block of the promise chain, we're going to return just the data. And then if there is an error, which hopefully there isn't, but if there is, we should catch it right here, pass back a fail confirmation, obviously, with the error message. Hopefully we won't even see this tonight, but it could happen. So. Okay, so this command will persist the data to our Turbo project. So the Turbo, whenever you create a Turbo project, you automatically get an environment with a lot of things right out of the box. Data persistence is one. File upload and file hosting is another, with automatic CDN distribution. That's all there. Email notifications, stuff. Just a lot of stuff that everyone uses. Or like social login, it's all hooked up into your Turbo project. So you already have these things in your project that you just created. We're going to use the data store right now. So we don't have to worry about setting up a database and all that crap. So let's get rid of this. Let's run the dev server again. And now this time, let's make sure that the user actually is logged in. So we go back here, and this time we sign up again. Okay. Now we get a lot more sort of thorough response. Like we're getting a unique identifier, a timestamp. That means the data has been successfully persisted to your Turbo backend. Okay, so now we're in business. Now we have actual data that's persisting. So what that means is if I go to my Turbo project, Right, here's my project that I'm working on right now. Click on this right here. You click on Data Store. You will see the profile I just created. It's persisted. Okay? So hopefully you see that as well.
Sorry, can you go back to off.js?
Sure. So line 7 of this file is what makes that persistence possible. The SDK gives you a whole rich set of functionality. This Turbo SDK is what makes it possible to do file uploads to your project, send emails, social login, stuff like that. It all happens over here. So you guys probably learned Heroku in your boot camps, I assume.
Yeah.
Right, so you know in Heroku they have all those plugins, right? You have to sort of decide on an a la carte basis which ones you want. Well, imagine it's like when you create a project, you get a bunch of those plugins automatically. That's what I built on Turbo. So like the email notification, maybe you use SendGrid or Mailgun or MailChimp on Heroku's environment. Well, on Turbo, you just have the email notification. File hosting, maybe use Cloudinary. Very typical, very standard file hosting service. Well, in Turbo, it's already built in. And I built all that through Amazon. Turbo is a full Amazon environment, so I'm not leveraging third-party services everywhere. Otherwise, it would be a nightmare to build. It's all just Amazon. So the CDN happens through CloudFront rather than, what's the other one, Cloudflare. Just the Amazon solutions are what I use for that. Good?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So what we're going to do real quick now is create a login section in here as well. So if you go back to your sign up, right here, we're going to create one more form called login, which will also just be email, password, and that's it. That way we can maintain state of who's logged in, basically session management. So here, let's go back to our sign up mustache template and create another section right beneath the first one called login. Okay, just copied and pasted. Right, we're not going to be too picky about the UI for now. Obviously, it should go to a different endpoint. So instead of register, it should be just log in. I think that's pretty intuitive, right? And then log in. Okay, and login should also happen through post. Should also be done through a post. So we're going to keep that the same. Okay, so the most important change is on line 19. You see where it says /login. Just make sure you catch that, otherwise it's going to break down. Okay, so what that means is we got to go back to our auth file and create another endpoint to log in. Now that we have at least one user, that means we have someone we can log in. Okay. So before we head over and do that, just make sure you see this on your template. Very, very simple, right? And then head over to your auth route, and let's create a whole nother route. I'm just going to copy this. Whoops. And instead of register, it should be login, right? Login. And obviously, the Turbo SDK function shouldn't be create user on login. I would imagine that's pretty obvious. It should be login. That's the function for that. And it'll handle the auth for you is what this function does. So it'll check the password. If it's wrong, it'll bounce it back and say it's wrong password. If the user doesn't exist, it'll bounce that back. It'll just do that for you. What it doesn't do for you is session management, but we'll take care of that. It's very, very simple. We'll take care of that right away. But before we do, let's just make sure this is working. So far, so good. Everyone with me? So make sure you catch line 22, post /login, and line 23, turbo.login. That's it, okay? So let's test it out. So I logged in a user, lebronjames@gmail.com. So let's say Steph Curry is trying to log in. And I get user not found, right? Because I did not create that user, right? So let's try LeBron James again. But I'm going to deliberately enter the wrong password. incorrect password. Good. So it's just handled for you. Okay. And then last but not least, let's get it right. And on success, it just gives you back the user you logged in as. Okay. So that's all done for you. The authentication. So that's good. It makes life a lot easier. Good so far? But like I said a moment ago, what it does not do for you is maintain the session. So let's connect that right here. So right here on line 24, that's the success block. That means it worked, right? And the data object is the user. It may as well just be called the user. So what we want to do is connect to session. Okay, so you know how a few minutes ago I said I worked very hard to maintain the industry standards as much as I can? This is the only part of the environment where I have to deviate slightly. So on line 24, the session name has to be called Vertex session. It's a long story. I'll probably change that down the road to make it whatever you want to make it. But for now, it has to be called Vertex session. The environment is expecting that on deployment. So that's why it has to be Vertex session. What you actually bind to the session is anything you want. That's the same as usual. And it's going to be a JSON object format over here. So what we're doing is we're binding the session to the ID of the user on successful login. Okay? So what that means is this session is persisted across sessions, right? So if I log out, if I turn the browser off and turn it back on, that session key is still there. So what I can do is check the current user. Okay? So what we want to do next, but does everyone have this? Is we want to create another route inside here. This time it's going to be a get, going back to just normal, convention. So now I'm creating a get route for current user. This is going to identify the currently logged in user if there is one. Okay, and that's all done through the session. So if if the Vertex session is null, that means there's no user, right? No one is logged in, which is probably the most common state. So let's do user equals null. Right, so line 40 is probably the most common scenario. We should do another check for the actual user key. So if you look on where we actually define the session over here, line 24, you see how I create a user key? I'm just checking that key down here on line 49. Why even make that distinction? Because maybe you want to bind other stuff to a session beyond just the user. So a very typical scenario is like a shopping cart, right? Like if you add items to a cart, and then I'm sure you notice on Amazon, you add an item to a cart, you turn off your browser, come back later, it's still there, right? That has to be done through a session. That's a different session key, okay? Okay, so if we get past those first two checks, that means the user is logged in. We can just return that user object right here on line 60. We're just returning the data right back with the user ID so that we can see literally which user is logged in by ID number. Okay, so the endpoint is /auth/current user, but it's a get, which means we can just test it in the browser, right? So we do /auth/current user, and I'm not logged in because I did not bind the session on my first attempt. So this is the expected output. Does that make sense? So now let's go back to the template. And let's log in this time successfully. Okay, now I am logged in. It's the same output as before, but this time the session has been updated accordingly. So I could go to auth/current user. And that gives me the ID number of the currently logged in user. So it worked. So our session has been successfully updated with the logged in user. This is what we're going to use on the React side. So from a React standpoint, this is the key. If you don't have this working, the whole night's ruined. So get this working. I'm being a little bit over dramatic, but just make sure this works. Because otherwise,
Can you see auth.js?
Yep. Basically, we're predicating our entire React project on this part working. Because we need to identify the logged in user. Let's try to think of this from a React perspective. Like, what's going to happen? Why is this part so important? Well, when we load the React project, which is a fully client-side project, right? That's what React is, a client-side library. I know we can do server-side rendering, we'll get to that later, but for most purposes, it's client-side at the beginner level. So we're going to do the same thing. If it's a client-side library, what has to happen at some point? The React application at some point has to make a request to this endpoint, right? So it knows what the currently logged in user is. If this endpoint doesn't exist or if it doesn't work, none of that matters. Like they will never be able to identify the current user. That's obviously not good.
Should we go to index.js?
Sure.
Next one.
So it's a very good exercise to try and sort of like visually or mentally imagine kind of where React is going to leverage these things. Like how we haven't done any React yet, right? So why are we taking all this time to set up all these routes? Because React is going to need it to do certain things like check the logged in user, right? So now that route is properly configured to do that. Once React receives a logged in user, then you know who's logged in client side. You can do data. You can manipulate data with that, right? So if you actually look at your Turbo dashboard, I mean, it's a little bit simplified, but I'm doing that here, right? This is a React project, and it knows that I'm logged in. How does it know that? It's using an auth route, a current user route. Okay. All right, so thumbs up, thumbs down again. Okay. It's a decent percentage. Let's take another minute or two. So, like I was saying a few minutes ago, on line 60, we're getting the ID number of the login user, and that's it, right? Which is obviously good, but we can do better. Let's get the entire user profile, right? So that's what we really need, right? So let's go ahead, instead of this right here, let's comment this out. And let's do Turbo fetch. Yep. What's that? Catch. I haven't seen that movie in like a decade. Okay, so here we're just grabbing the current user from the back end so that we can get the entire user profile rather than just the ID number, which is obviously more informative than just the ID number. You're probably getting a sense by now that Turbo, the SDK, heavily revolves around promises. So make sure you understand that. Promises are certainly going to, they probably are already the standard as opposed to old school completion handlers. That's sort of falling by the wayside. So I'm sure they emphasize that at full stack. Is that accurate?
Promises?
Yeah, good, good, good. All right, so let's test this guy out. So here, now I'm getting nothing, so. Yeah, I made a mistake. It's fetch one. Excuse me, fetch one. Because that's the fetch command for index by ID, the unique identifier. So my apologies. All right, so once you do that, on the auth route, now you get the entire logged in user. Great. So React will leverage this endpoint to identify the currently logged in user, which means we're ready to start writing some React code. Okay? So thumbs up, thumbs down. Good, great, excellent. Okay, so we just did about an hour of backend. That's good. We set up our backend for our client-side work to leverage. Notice how it's strongly decoupled, right? There's nothing on the backend we just did that has anything to do with React. You want to keep it that way. You want to be very, very modular in your development. It's a very important thing. So head over to SRC now. Index.js. Now here's our React entry point. Let's begin working on this guy. So let's remove all this initial code. When we head over to localhost 3000, this UI that we're looking at here, right, is this component, the intro component. So that if we just remove that, that entire UI is wiped out. Let's go ahead and do that. And then let's just inject some of our own UI just to make sure it works. Okay. Like I said, the scaffold provides a React Redux environment out of the box. So the provider component, which you may have noticed, is a Redux concept, which basically connects your application to a Redux environment. We're not going to worry about that for now, but just leave it there because we are going to use it probably about an hour from now. So here we're just adding some basic UI just to make sure it works. Now, if we head over to our terminal, you probably know by now that it won't render. Right, we need to run Webpack to recompile the code. So we open a new tab by doing Command T and run Webpack. And make sure you see a couple of green lines pop out so that our React code has successfully been recompiled so that now when we reload the page, we should see our React code. Again, I'm just basing off the room in that no one here is really a raw beginner, but does anyone not understand what I just did right here? It's okay if you don't. Okay, so now if I go back to the home page, now I should see the new UI, right? Which means we now control the React UI. So let's get started on the React code, finally. So let's get rid of that intro component. And let's head over to our terminal again. Turn off the server, cd to the SRC, and cd into the components directory. Let's create an admin profile, an admin component, whose job will be to do what you think, an admin page. So like update your user username, image, bio, whatever user profile typically comes with. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that right now. So head over to the components directory, and inside the containers directory, subdirectory, let's create an admin.js. The containers are basically the components that are connected to the Redux store, which I'll explain again in much greater detail when we do that. But again, I'm kind of operating off the assumption that you already understand those dynamics. So inside the admin.js, let's go ahead and start writing our first lines of React. Only take an hour. Okay, very simple component, pretty much the simplest component possible. This is the admin container, is what we will render. And that's pretty much it. I would imagine this is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, and head back to your index in the SRC, and then let's render the admin component. Instead. Okay, and then same as before, don't forget to run Webpack. So you probably know by now you can run Webpack just indefinitely by passing in the watch flag. So just go ahead and do that so we don't have to constantly rerun Webpack. So over here, just go back and run Webpack with the watch flag. Clean build, we're good on that. And then let's go ahead and make sure we're seeing the right components. I forgot to run the dev server, so let me just go ahead and launch that. All right, so right there is what I'm looking at. It's kind of hard to see, but do you guys see that? Do you see the same thing? Right here? Okay, how's that working out for you guys? Good? All right. So I'm going to do another bootstrap class here, same class container. Okay. We're going to use we're going to override what's called a lifecycle method to make the API request to see the current user, right? That's why we spent an hour setting up those routes, right? Let's now use those routes. So what are lifecycle functions? Who already understands? Who can give me a brief description of what that means? Or I guess a better question is, does anyone not know what I mean by lifecycle functions? Okay, so React components automatically have a series of functions that get called by the system, not by you. Those are called lifecycle methods. They essentially happen when specific events take place that are pertinent to the component's life, like when it was created, when it shows up, when it will show up, when it disappears. These are called lifecycle functions, right? So we can invoke those functions, or not invoke them. We don't really invoke them. We override them. And the system invokes them when we care about certain events. So the event we care about here is when the component shows up. Okay? That is a specific lifecycle method. Does anyone know it offhand? Whoa, I just heard 10 different things. Yeah, component did mount. So component did mount. So this is a lifecycle function. This will get called by the system when the component shows up. Okay, and here all I'm doing is a console log to make sure that that was successful. So what that means is this time I can reload the app with the console running, right? And hopefully I'll see this right here, which means the lifecycle function successfully triggered at the right moment in time. right there. See that? So that means it worked. So right there is where the UI is now sort of taken over by React. So right there is where we want to make the API call that we created for the current user. So now, because that's where we need it. Like we're going to need to know who's logged in, right? So right here, we want to know who is logged in. This is where we need to know, right? So we need to make a request to our backend route to make the auth request, the current user request that we wrote a few minutes ago. So I'm going to use a library called superagent to do that. So John, was it? John? Yeah, this is one of those libraries that I use that there's like 10 options that we talked about in the lobby. So this is a preference that I like. But other libraries are Axios, Fetch, whatever. These are all pretty good libraries. I'm a fan of superagent. So npm is superagent. Superagent is just a very standard HTTP request library, which will make our requests for us. So make sure you install superagent, and then we're going to import it right here. Which means right here on line 9, we have to make that request. That's where it's going to happen, right? So that's where superagent is going to do its work. Now I want to be clear, I'm taking shortcuts tonight for the sake of time. This is not normally how I would write the code. I'm taking a few shortcuts. What I would normally do is write what's called an asynchronous action to create this effect, and then bind the data to the reducer. We're not going to do that tonight because we'll be here past midnight. So that's something I do in my courses. If you want to follow up with me after the demo for a more robust paid course, I'll show you how to do that. That's what we do in the courses. A lot of that's in the videos too, so you can just watch my videos, and it's all there too. But tonight, just to be clear, I'm cutting a few corners for the sake of time. Okay? So we're going to make a request right now using superagent. It's obviously going to be a GET request. There are a lot of stuff going on here, but really what matters is line 10. Line 10 is the most important. Can you see what we're doing here? We're making a request to the current user route we wrote 20 some odd minutes ago, right? That route identifies the current user if it exists. The rest is just procedural, like this is how you make the request. This actually looks like a promise, but it's not. It's just a series of function calls, like nested function calls. And this is more of a conventional callback structure on line 13, completion handler. If there's an error, just console log the error. Hopefully we won't see that tonight. If it works, just console log the success. Okay? So I have Webpack on watch, which means it should be already recompiled. It's good to check back in on Webpack though, just in case. Run the dev server. And let's see here. And there I am. LeBron James is still logged in. So very nice. Now we have it working, properly identifying the currently logged in user. So that's good to go. So clearly, this is a very important part of the entire exercise, right? So make sure you have this working. So thumbs up, thumbs down. Excellent. Oh, no? No.
I had an issue getting the user before we left to the server side.
Okay.
Yeah, before I leave the endpoints. So I have to fix that. Everything else is.
Great. Now what we're going to do, let me just double check the JSON. Okay, so the user on the success callback is inside the user key. So let's go ahead and parse that guy out. Okay, so const current user with current.
That's what these things.
All right, so now we have we're just digging a little bit deeper. Keep in mind, the auth route, the current user route, returns success even if there's no one logged in. It just returns null as the current user. So we want to make sure we cover that scenario as well, right here. Now that we have the proper data identified client side, React side, now let's start using it to manipulate the current user. So I'm just going to do another quick run. All I did is parse out some JSON, like nothing crazy there, right? It's just a little bit deeper inside the JSON structure. So here's what we have right here. Line 22 is clearly the most important line so far of the workshop. Okay. So now what we want to do is send this data to the React, more specifically the Redux environment to store it. Okay, so now let's discuss let's consider how we can manipulate this data. One way is we can take this current user and bind it to the component state, and then use the component state to make follow-up requests for updates and things like that. That'll actually work pretty well, and that would be a very good intro React demonstration, a non-Redux demonstration. However, if we want to use Redux, what we want to do is take this data and throw it into the Redux store. And the store will, and more specifically the reducers, will maintain the data, and we want to do all of our manipulations through that. Okay, that's what makes it a Redux project. Now, in this particular scenario, this literal project, I wouldn't do that because this is the only component we're going to use tonight. So if we only have one component, Redux is overkill. It's overkill, right? But in a more realistic scenario, in a more typical project, you don't have one component. You have a lot of components. My Turbo dashboard is up to like 60 components, right? And they all want to have sort of a central point of truth, the store, right? And that's what we're going to use tonight to maintain our user data. So what we're going to do, I'll just discuss real quick, in case this is very new to you, how that data flow happens. All right, so what we have here on this diagram is a very simplified, sort of like oversimplified illustration of the React Redux data relationships. Right, the green circles are components. So in our project, this component, this page component right here, is the admin component that we just wrote. That's this guy right here. Okay. All the data belongs in what's called the store, or sometimes called the state. So the state over here on top is where all the data belongs. However, it's a little bit misleading at times. The store can be best thought of as a combination of what's called reducers. So you can think of a reducer kind of like a mini store that's responsible for handling a subset of data. So these reducers right here, think of this reducer block right there. That really should be like multiple files, like 5 or 6 files. Every reducer is responsible for a different subset of data. So one way you can think of that, what I like to think of it as, is every reducer is responsible for a different data type. So if we're talking about our job application project, we automatically have at least 2 data types, a user, which we just created, but also a job post. That's a whole separate data type we didn't even integrate yet. It should be in this project. That means in my typical scenarios, immediately you have two reducers, a user reducer and a job reducer. In all likelihood, there's going to be many more than that. Like who posts jobs? Companies, right? So that's going to be another data type, company. So right now we're up to 3 reducers, a user reducer, a company reducer, and a job reducer, so forth and so on. Are you with me? So that's how I conceptualize reducers. And then they all come together. They get combined in the store. So, you know, every Redux sort of class or tutorial emphasizes that the store is a single source of truth, which is very true. But you want to think of a store as a combination of reducers. So, like it's like a reducer is like a mini store. Okay. What happens in any project of any significance is things happen to data, right? What are we about to do? We're going to create a setup where a user can change his username. We're going to manipulate data, right? Otherwise, it's not a very interesting project, right? Those data manipulations happen through actions, okay? So we want to create a couple of actions tonight. Actions communicate with reducers, and then the reducer makes the change. The reducer does a lot of the heavy lifting. It does the actual change to the data. And then the store is then updated, and then the component hears about it and reloads. That's the React Redux cycle, okay? So we're going to implement that cycle tonight with user admin, okay? So what that means is we have some data right here on line 22, right here. Data, that's some data right there. That data belongs in the reducer, right? It's the current user, so that's a user object. So it should be in the user reducer, which conveniently already exists. So if you look at the reducers directory, you'll see we have a user reducer. Okay, let's get rid of pretty much all of it, because there's too much like scaffolded code here to make this worthwhile. Okay, so here's the user reducer reduced, broken down to like nothing. I just stripped it all down to except just that one function. Okay, so like I said, reducers are responsible for maintaining state for individual subsets of data. So here you have to begin with an initial state, right? So we have var initial state, and let's have a current user object as null. So basically, when the app loads, the current user is nobody, which is what it should be, right? That key, line 2, will be populated when we get the current user. Okay, so that's where the current user will eventually go. So again, what are the mechanisms through which that happens? That happens through an action. So going back to our diagram, right? We now have to deliver the current user via an action to that reducer, right? That has to happen now, right? So what we want is to set up inside here the code to receive actions. That's what happens here. That's like fundamentally what happens in the reducers, is you set up the code to receive actions, okay? So that's normally done through a switch statement. So okay, so here is a very, very non-functional switch statement. So actions, when you deliver an action, actions are distinguished by what's called a type. A type is basically a description of the action. So every action has a type. Just think of it that way. Every action has a type. And that type is typically something that's describing the action, like user updated, user logged in, job created, stuff like that. Things that happen to the data. So that's described to the action type. And depending on the action type is where we determine what we do with the data. So what we want to do here is set up a case for current user receipt. Okay, and that's all we're going to do. Just console log, and that's it. Okay, so this is a very, very like non-functional action, but it'll work. It should work. Like it'll receive the action or reducer. Which now means we have to create the corresponding action to trigger this, to send to the reducer, okay? So going back to the diagram, the important thing you gotta remember here is that actions go to reducers. You see this? This is the part we're at right now in this diagram, basically this yellow line. So we wanna send this action to that reducer, okay? So let's go to our actions file. So actions right here. Again, these are all sample actions. So we can let's get rid of all of these. And current user received. Okay, so here is the action it's called an action creator, but whatever. Here's the action creator we will use to send data to the reducer, right? And remember what I said a few minutes ago, every action has a type, right? So line 9 is mandatory, right? The whole thing will break if we don't include a type. However, beyond that, we can add whatever more metadata we want, as much as we want. So I'm just going to add a generic key called data, and to that data key will be the user object, okay? But the type here is an empty string. That's not what we want. Remember the type, if you go back to the reducer, is called current user received. That's the type, right? So we want to make sure that this type is the same over here. Otherwise, it will not invoke the proper reducer case. Okay? So this type right here is what determines what the reducer will do, assuming we wrote code for that type. Okay, which we did, which for now is just a console log. Okay? Good. Go ahead and check in on Webpack. Make sure Webpack isn't complaining. This is actually a good time for just a complete rebuild. So I'm just going to do that. And then head over to your admin container. Now we need to call that action right here, right? Right here, line 22, is where the current user is received. It's literally where that happens. So right here is where we want to call that action. You with me? So let's hook up the mechanisms to do that. So, all right, good. Webpack is happy. So all the way on top, we have to import a couple things. We have to import what's called connect. Connect is a convenient function from the React Redux library that does pretty much what it sounds like. It connects our component to the store. We also need to import the actual actions, right? So this is in the containers. So 1, 2 actions. Right, we have to have the actions to call them, right? Good. Now head down to the bottom, all the way to the bottom. We have to set up a function down here called dispatch. Well, actually, let's do state to props. State to props. Okay, we're going to leave that empty for now, but we're going to fill it up in a few minutes. But for now, we're going to use another function down here called dispatch to props. And here is where we will define, like, how can I put, connect the action to the component, right? So the action is called current user received, right? Okay, this part, make sure you catch this properly. This is very detail oriented. But you see on line 48, we define a new function called current user received. That function is nothing more than a liaison to the action with the same name. Okay? Now what's important to understand is that you don't literally call actions. You do what's called you dispatch actions, and the dispatch will actually call it for you. This is what will send it to the Redux environment. Okay, and that happens through the Redux library. And that's why we're wrapping it inside of a dispatch function right here. Okay? So you don't directly call actions, but you can kind of think of it that way. It will be okay. It's just a liaison. It's a proxy from one to the other. Okay? Now what we have to do now is actually connect these functions. So we do connect down here, state to props, and then dispatch to props. So now line 53 is what makes this entire project a bona fide React Redux project. What we're doing here on line 53 is connecting this component to the Redux store. Literally, it's called connect, right? It's connecting it to the Redux store. So this component now officially qualifies as what's called a smart component or a container component. It's connected to the store. So they may have taught you smart versus dumb component. That's sort of the old nomenclature for the distinction between two broad kinds of components. Basically what that means is any component that's connected to the store is quote unquote a smart component. It's connected to the data. Okay? It does a lot more than just render HTML. It does more than that. It has much greater responsibilities. Most notably, it's connected to this store. Okay? So the actual mechanics through which that happens can be a little confusing. If you look at line 48, we're creating a new object called current user received, which is just a sort of a pass-through to the actions, right? What happens here on line 53 is that this key, current user received, gets applied as a property to the component. So the component now has a property called current user received. It's a property on the component, which in itself is a function. So what that means is we can go back up here, right here, and we can now call that property. So this.props current user received. So line 25, this.props.current user received. It's an attribute on the props because of the connect function. Connect is what does that for you. Okay, so it applies it as a property to the component. Usually if I make a mistake, it's somewhere in this neighborhood because E before I before E, all that stuff. So I'm just making sure I didn't make that mistake. Okay, check in on Webpack. Run the dev server, which it is, and let's see what happens. You guys see this line right here? Current user received. Okay, that's the most important line. Now it's the most important line because this is coming from the reducer. Right? So what that means is we successfully dispatched an action to the reducer. The reducer didn't do anything with it because we didn't even confirm it's happening yet. But the reducer has successfully received the action. Right? That's what matters. Okay? So you guys see that? Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Excellent. All right, good. So if you go back to the date actions index, you'll see that we also included another key to the payload called data. Action.data is now part of the payload that we can use. So if we go to the reducer, we can do better than just this console log. We can do, spell it right, but we can do action.data, right? Because we added more data to the payload. So now when I reload the app, it says current user received from the reducer, but it gives me the entire user profile. Okay, now we're really in business. So what that means is right here on line 9, the action.data, that is the current user, right? So we want to reassign line 2 with this data right here. That's sort of this is the reducer's primary responsibility, is to update the state, which is now what we're about to do. So what we want to do here, before I continue, how are we doing? Is everyone with me? Yeah. Thumbs up, thumbs down? Yeah. So what we want to do here, just want to make sure I'm still recording this. Sometimes I forget to record. So on line 6, we're making a copy of the state. So this is very important to understand. This seems a little bit unintuitive, but in React in general, and this applies to Redux as well, you never update state correctly ever. It just never happens. You always make a copy of the state, mutate the copy, and then reassign that value as the new state. That's what we're doing right here. So here, we're creating a copy of the original state, right? And then we're going to mutate the copy with the current user. And then here on line 12, we're returning the new state that reassigns the state. And now lines 11 and 12 are the most important lines in this project. This is the fundamental premise of Redux. Whenever this sequence takes place, any component that's connected to it will re-render. Okay? However, right now, there are no components connected to this. So what we need to do is go back to the admin.js and connect this component, this reducer, to that component. And literally through the function connect. So what we want to do is go back here. Remember how we left this empty? And now it's time to use it. So let's do user equals state dot. Question is, how do I know what to put here? So before we fill that in, the question is, where do we even figure that out? So we go to the stores directory right here, folder, open up the index. This code, for the most part, is standard code. Like, you can just leave this as is. You don't have to ever write this. But here, what matters is line 17, 18, 19. You see how in line 18 says user user reducer. This is where the reducers are combined into the store. So I said earlier, the store is really a collection of reducers, right? That's how you want to think of it. Well, here is where those reducers are brought together, okay? So in a more typical project, it's not just line 18, it's like lines 18 through 30, right? You might have like 10 reducers, right? So the only changes you're going to make here typically are adding and removing new reducers. Everything else you can just leave alone, it'll work. So on line 18, it says user. That's the key on the store. So what you want to do, going back to your admin file, is state.user. And this is essentially a direct connection to the reducer. Again, these are all analogies. It's not literally true, so a React purist would be like, that's wrong. But you can think of it that way, and you're not far off. Okay, so now our admin.js component, our container, is now connected to the user reducer as well. It now has another property called user, this.props.user, right? So what we can do is grab the current user, const this.props.user.current user. Now, where am I getting this key from? Well, I said a few seconds ago, it's this.props.user is essentially a direct connection to the user reducer, essentially. So if you look at the user reducer, you'll see that it has a key called current user. You see that? It's I'm just referencing that key. That's all I'm doing. So here, there it is. Now keep in mind, it's not always, the initial state is null, right? So console log. So assuming this is set up properly, we are going to see both of these console logs happen. Who can tell me why? Why are we going to see both of them happen?
I think because the first time the complement renders, it didn't get any values from the store.
Mhm.
And when after it mounts, it'll call the option and get the actual information.
Exactly, that's correct. So on the initial render, there is no current user, because in the reducer, the initial state is what? Null. That's going to happen for a split second, or as long as the API takes to return. But then when the API does return, it'll go through the action sequence again, and it'll call render twice. But the second time, just like you said, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Yeah, well,
Devin, just like Devin said, it will be populated with the current, hopefully, if we set it up right. So let's try that out. Twice. Admin.js, no current user on the initial load, just like you said. Make the API request, action sequence runs through, back here again, current user this time is populated. That's exactly it. So we saw it twice. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, well, let's take a few minutes to make sure this part works. So now that we have the user in the reducer, we can render data using that. So let's call it user admin. All right, so that's all I did right here. Lines 38 through 43, just another very simple input form, right? Where we can update the username. I'm going to put it in a form itself. Okay, how's that? Does that make sense? Just simple HTML form, nothing crazy. No endpoints, so no method, no action, nothing like that, just post form. What I want to do though is I only want to render this I only want to render that form if there's a currently logged in user. In other words, if no one's logged in, there's no purpose for this form to exist, right? So let's do that the following way. Current user equals null. So here I'm setting up a simple ternary, which basically says if there is no current user, don't do anything. Just don't render anything. Makes sense, right? So what should happen is for a split second, we see a blank area, and then it'll populate with the form. Unless you made a mistake, like I just made. So current user not defined, it's a typo, like that. Capital U. So. All right. Okay, and then inside here, inside that input, I'm going to set what's called a default value. To the username, which is probably null for now. Because on login, we didn't set a username, it was done by email. So the initial state is going to be null for the username. So that's still what we expect to see. Okay, good. So let's set up a function for this guy. So on change, this update username. So right here on line 43, I'm invoking a function called update username, which that function doesn't exist, right? So that's not going to work. So we have to define that function. So before I get to that, make sure you have that right there. Good. And let's go ahead and define it up here. It's coming from an input, so it takes an event parameter, which is good. And then that gives us the actual key values that are inside the input, so update username. And then we can just console log that. And then while we're up here, let's create another function called update user. And this is the actual function that will commit the changes. Like we'll actually create the update, we'll actually update the current user. So let's just do a console log over here. This will also take an event, because it's going to come from that button. The button will try to submit the form. We don't want it to actually do that, so we do prevent default to prevent that from happening. Because what we want to do instead is send the request, the data via super agent to our backend, which will handle the update function. Which means we now want to bind our button to that function, right? So down here, that's going to be an on-click. Kind of went a little fast there, but I think it's pretty intuitive what we just did, right? So check Webpack. Webpack is still happy. That's good. Let's try it out. Type in some stuff here. You guys see that down here? That means it's working. And then let's try the button. There it is. Cool. You guys got that? So the functions were properly hooked up. That's pretty much all we confirmed. So what we want to do with that is grab the updated values in the username, right? And then we want to send a request to our backend to literally update the user. But that has to happen here, right? Because it's persisted to a database in the backend. Now let's think about this from a Redux environment flow, right? Again, the minutia is tough to make sure you get, it's very detail oriented, but you don't want to lose the forest for the trees, right? You want to make sure you understand the entire flow here. So what's going to happen is we're going to send the data, the updated username, to an update function on the backend. We've got to go back to the express routes. It's going to update the user. It's going to return the data with the updated values back to here, right? And then what's going to happen back here? We've got to send that new data to the reducer with the updated values, and then the reducer will reload with the component. That's the cycle. Okay, that's what has to happen now, and the rest is details. Okay, so what's really hard about all this, I mean, not to say it's hard, but what's hard for beginners, I should say, is keeping the mental model in here. Like, what's supposed to happen? Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? I don't understand why we're making this call right here. That part is what you need to really keep straight. And if that means you need to understand that without doing any of the programming, then do that. Forget the programming and make sure you understand the concept here, because without really understanding that, what tends to happen is beginners tend to just do a whole bunch of programming for nothing. I'm sure we've all been down that road. It's kind of like you're reading a book or a newspaper for 10 minutes, you have no idea what you just read, right? We've all been down that road, right? Like, that happens a lot in programming. You start sort of falling down a path, not really understanding why, and that can ruin an entire day. I've certainly done that myself many, many times. So the thing to understand is, what are we doing here? We want to send the update to our backend. The backend will literally commit the update. It'll persist it. Return data. That data will come back here. And then here, we've got to send the data to the reducer like we did earlier, and it'll actually persist it to the store. And then it's done. The cycle is then complete. Okay? So let's do that now. That's the next objective. So here, right here where it says update username, we didn't really do anything with this. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this dot set state. Oh wait, we got to set up the state. I'm sorry, I forgot a step. So you go all the way to the top right here, and we're going to set a state. Okay, so now here our component has a state. I'm sure like everyone learned this in day one of React. This is just setting up state. So once you have that, we're going to set the state with the username. So this dot set state. Oops, sorry. Okay. Yeah, it'll come back. It does that all the time. Okay. So that's all I did. 38, 39, 40. That's all I did. Okay. So now on line 45, think about again what has to happen. We need to send this data, this updated username, to our backend to commit the change, right? So let's do that. If this, I'm going to do some very simple validation here. Okay, so the initial state is null everywhere. So if you don't type anything in, there are no changes. Don't commit anything. Just don't do that. Good. So far, so good. Okay. Then, assuming we do have actual changes, we want to send the updates to our backend now. Our backend is currently not prepared to handle updates. So we got to swing back to the backend, create another endpoint just for user updates, and then hit it with this guy right here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we go back to our routes. This is going to be an auth function, right? Let's make a post out of it. So I'm just copying a post right here. It's going to be update, like that. And then let me just double check real quick if I wrote this into the documentation. Yeah, update user. All right, it's good documentation. All right, so here, we're going to use the update user function, which takes the user ID and whatever parameters we're updating. So this parameters argument is going to come from the post body. That's just rec.body. Okay, so it's going to be username, colon, whatever. The user ID is a little bit more nuanced. You don't want to pass that in with a post request. Otherwise, anyone can send a post request and just update it that way. That's no good, right? So we want to use this right here. Right, you see how down here, the current user function, we're checking the vertex session. In other words, if no one's logged in, don't even let this request pass, right? Because otherwise, anyone can make updates to anyone's profile. We don't want that. So I'm going to copy these two blocks that says no one's logged in over here. You guys see where I'm doing that right there? Okay, we're going to pass those in right there and say pass back fail messages. User not logged in, or not authorized, whatever is appropriate in this scenario. But once these two are confirmed, then we can literally update the user, and it has to be whoever's logged in. So that gives us a little bit better security. We don't need to actually grab the user, because remember, the session just stores the ID right there. So there's no need to make a follow-up request. I mean, you could if you want to, but it seems like overkill. All we need is the ID, right? So that's it right there. And then the rest is just promise chains, just regular promise sequence. So let's just copy that from one of the other ones. Just regular promise chain sequence, success, failure. I just copied it from another one. You can just do the same, really. For those of you who want to go into contracting, by the way, this is a huge reason why I get the contracts I get. I can go back and forth from the front end to the back end just in minutes, just like this, right? And that has distinguished me for early stage startups tremendously over the past 3 or 4 years. What tends to happen is people specialize in the front end or the back end. So if I'm just a pure React developer with no real Node back end skills or Python Django or wherever the back end happens to be, right? What I got to do is submit a ticket for this and wait for whoever the back-end dev is, who may be in a different time zone. In my cases, you probably is in a different time zone, if not a different country, and wait for them to fill out that ticket, which might be 24 hours, 72 hours, whatever, right? or I can just do what I just did, be done with it, and move on, right? And so from an early stage startup standpoint, that has been a huge asset for me in terms of building clientele. So I basically learned what I learned as a matter of necessity, like because I was trying to earn a living, so I had to build up more of my skill set. And so this is pretty helpful for that. Okay, so that's done. Now let's swing back to the React side, and let's call that function. So super agent again. This time it's a post, and it's update user. I think it's just update. Yeah, update. It's not a promise. I keep forgetting that. So, body. Okay, so here we're just sending a super agent request to the endpoint that we just wrote with the updated username right here. And then the rest is just sort of procedural, just this is how you complete the chain. With a couple, visual confirmations, and that's it. So hopefully this will work, we'll find out. But again, try to maintain the higher level overview, right? Let's say this does work. Let's assume we set this up properly. What should happen next on line 60? What are we supposed to do with this guy right here? Remember, this is a React Redux assignment, Devin.
You're going to send the dispatch out.
Correct. Send this data back to the reducer. But let's not do that yet because we got to make sure this works. So let's try that right now. So okay. This is LeBron James, right? So LBJ. So here's the confirmation. Here's the console log, right? Look at the username key right there. Successfully updated. So obviously that's good. Okay. Let's take another look at the actual Turbo dashboard itself. So if I hit the data store over here, now I have the username over here. So that's definitely a good sign, right? And then last but not least, let's check the actual auth current user. And there's the username on the left-hand side with what I just entered. You guys see that? Does that work?
Can we see that in .js again?
Yes. Right here. Front-end React, Redux with back-end Node Express is where you want to be in today's market, hands down. And you throw on React Native in there, you can do whatever you want at that point. You just pick your clients and charge whatever. It's easy from there. Why Node Express versus like another backend like Python, Django, Ruby on Rails, PHP, whatever? Those are all fine. And I actually see that a lot. Python, Django, especially with React Redux front end. The problem there is that the server-side rendering is, if not harder, it's impossible in certain cases. For example, if you use a Flask backend, with a React Redux front end, and then you want to implement server-side rendering for like SEO benefits, it's time to start over on the back end. You have to do it with Node Express. Now, a lot of my assignments in the past 12 to 18 months have been along those lines, where people will set up a back-end stack using whatever back-end they're comfortable with, because that's what the back-end team does. So typically it's Ruby on Rails or Python Django. And then they'll hire a React Redux guy, me, to write the front end, right? And then at some point we have this conversation, and then either the client rewrites the back end or the funding runs out and I move on to the next contract. This has been happening for a year. So there's a lot of opportunities in that space if you're the right developer to handle both sides of the equation. Because my client is typically a non-technical person. He's an entrepreneur. He's a founder. Right? He's the guy who raises the money, or she. I've had many female clients. So they're the guys that raise the money, right? They don't know React versus Python versus. It's not their job to know that. That's not what they're supposed to know. It's your job as the consultant to make the right decisions from a business standpoint as well as a technical standpoint. It's a very important distinction that a lot of programmers just don't think, right? And as a consultant, I don't have a choice. I have to think that way. And that's what keeps me busy. So it keeps me in demand. So these are important things. Like I was saying earlier, a couple hours ago, don't overreact. This is a business decision, not a technical decision. Why did I say don't overreact? So I can hire a guy at 25 bucks an hour who's just starting out to work on my JavaScript jQuery, because if I wrote my entire landing page in React, I got to hire a React guy. And I'm a React guy. We're not cheap. So I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot for that. That would be a poor business decision. So if you can clearly articulate that you understand that to your clients, you separate yourself from, I would say, 95% of programmers. Because programmers are technical people. Right? We're technical people. We think technically. So understand that. Who's got this working? Thumbs up. Cool. So now let's send this guy, just like Devin said, to the reducer. So this returns, let me just make sure I got the JSON keys properly. Same JSON, right? So it returns it in the user key right there. So we want to get the current user. Yeah, you know, normally I would do a null check here, but I'm just going to bypass that for now. And let's discuss kind of what our options are here. We can create another action called user updated, which would probably be like the more proper way to do this, right? Just another action just saying user updated, and it'll just send the data. However, inside that action, what are we going to do? We're going to take that updated user and reassign it to the current user, right? That's the new user. That's the same thing as getting user received. It's the same thing. We can just call the same action. Does that make sense? Because it's the same end result. So we just do this.props current user received. Now, when I reload the page, look at what happens. You see how the username is already in there? That's because of the default value key in the input. So this definitely confirms that the update worked, right? So now let's try it again. That's LeBron James, he's king. You know. Okay, so user updated. So now it's inside the reducer. If I reload, that's going to still be there. Now let's make it really visually confirmed, right? So instead of user admin, right? Well, hold on, I kind of went too fast here. Everyone got that working?
No.
Okay, so take your time, get that working.
Code. Can you put the code down?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, I missed it.
So line 62 is pretty key as well. Understanding what what actions you can use. You don't want to write an action for everything. You want to be judicious about how you expand your code base. Also, just to let you know, I started this project tonight for a reason. I'm going to actually continue this project on my own as a tutorial. I'll just record it on my own. I just figured I'd kill two birds with one stone tonight. So this is going to be part one of probably a 7 to 10 part tutorial that I'll just record on my own. So just check back in later for that.
Excuse me, is there a break?
We're almost done.
Okay.
Do you have it working?
I'm sorry?
Do you have
Oh,
it
yeah.
working? Everything good? Thumbs up, thumbs down. So now what we're going to do last, right here where it says user admin, we want visual confirmation right here as to who the actual user is. So you know what? I'm going to make this a little bit less confusing. I don't like the way this is poorly organized. So, excuse me. Just set it back to that. That's easy. Just a welcome sign right there. Okay, and then here, let's do username equals that. So I'm creating a local variable right there on line 70, just called username, initializes an empty string. And if the current user is populated, we'll just fill that in. Yeah, it's cleaner code than before. Which means we can just render it right there if it exists. So here is the username, right, from the backend. Now, if I change it again, you see how it still shows the old username, right, until the changes are committed in the reducer, right? The reducer, or the store, is the single source of truth. So until that changes, this UI on top will not update. So when I hit the update here, and there it is. That means it was successfully committed. Does that make sense? So obviously I can keep on doing that. So and if I reload, it'll show the last one, wherever the last one was. And that's all going through the React Redux flow. Okay. So this is clearly an oversimplified example, but you got to start simple, obviously, so you understand how the data interacts, how things interact. But even for a simple project like this, right, we're already over 2 hours to get this set up, right? So, and it's a strong room. It's not like you guys aren't complete beginners, right? And it still kind of takes a while to get things up and working, right? So React Redux is a challenging stack, especially when you throw in a Node Express environment on the back end. So, to answer your question earlier, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name? Anna, to answer Anna's question, yes, it pays more for that reason, because it's simply harder to find good React Redux developers. And that's also why I make very calculated decisions as to when to use it, right? Because it's harder to find React Redux developers. So if I run Turbo 360, it's my company. I'm responsible for budgeting properly. If I'm haphazard about that, and I just hire all React Redux developers, at the cheap end in New York City, that's $50 an hour. That's the cheap end, right? And it goes up from there, right? So I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot like that. It's my company. It's my money. I'm not going to do that, right? So if you carry that mentality on to your work, to whoever you work with on a client basis, either as a contractor or even as a full-time, any supervisor will appreciate that you're looking at things from a business perspective as a programmer, because it's pretty hard to find that. And if you're a good programmer, then you're what we call a unicorn. Like, that's just so hard to find. A good programmer who understands the business side of things, who can clearly articulate these matters in a fashion that non-technical people can understand. If that's you, you're a unicorn. So you need to think of it from that point of view. We don't make money unless there's a business to generate, right? Nobody pays me to program for fun. I wish that was the case, but that does not happen. So I have to look at things from a business angle. Before I shut down the video and all that stuff, does anyone want to go over any more code or have any questions that you want to go through on this?
Just having an issue like with the rendering of the form input. We use that itinerary in the admin.js.
Admin.js form.
Yeah.
Okay, right here. Yes.
I'm logging out currently using it as undefined, so it thinks it's null. So
There's probably a case sensitivity issue. Make sure it's capital U.
I do have capital U. I think it's probably somewhere before that I might have missed.
Okay. Usually it's just a case sensitivity
Yeah,
issue. Almost always. 98%, 99%.
I gotta find it though. Other than that, I'm good.
So what I plan on doing, moving down the road, I've been doing a lot of these demos. I've been doing these types of demos for over a year now. What I'm starting to do more and more is sort of brand myself and my company to startups now. So I'm in this WeWork. There's a startup incubator literally right there. I've been talking to a lot of startups, running groups, running demos like this for startups. Obviously not programming demos. They're not interested in that. But they're more interested in how to recruit a good programmer, how to distinguish a good programmer from a bad one, what technical things you should be aware of, what are the biggest time sinks and cost sinks into a startup, right? Where can you avoid bad mistakes? I'm doing a lot of these demos as well. So moving down the road, what I want to start doing, if you're interested, is doing sort of joint demos. So over the holiday, I want to do demos where we have programmers like you guys in a room with a bunch of startups, like a networking events, with hopefully some actual coding, because I'm a programmer before I'm a businessman. Like I'm a programmer. I love programming. I cannot overemphasize how much I do this. We're on hour 2.5. I could go for 5 more hours. That's not a problem. No drink, no break. No, I can just keep going. On my weekend demos, I do that. That's actually what happens on the paid weekend event. So I do weekend crash courses, Saturday, Sunday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. once a month. So the next one is this weekend. It's $500 if you're interested. You will get your money's worth. We're right here in this room, 8 hours straight, until the people say, oh, we need a break. And that's usually what happens, and then take a break. The point is, I guess my point is that this is fun for me. I love doing this, and I'm very lucky that people actually pay me to do this. So that's sort of almost like icing on the cake. If that does not describe you, you need to really consider whether or not this is for you. Yeah, I'm not one of those people who's like everyone can program. False. That's wrong. You have to have a level where you can't get enough of this if you want to be top 1%, elite level, top 1. You can't get enough of this. I program all day, every day, nonstop. It's unhealthy, literally unhealthy. Like I need to get exercise. So like it's a problem. I don't have a girlfriend. I don't have a wife. I only have like 3 good friends, and like that's it. This is all I do, right? And luckily, I can also speak to the business side of things, right? That's just something I can do. It's probably just because I've been doing it for so long, right? But the point is, this is programming. This is our industry. So we're lucky to be in an industry like that. I think we are. If you're one of those people who like me, I just love doing this. So I guess my message, what I'm trying to say is that, I'm like you 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I was not a CS major in college. I think I already said that. I was a high school math teacher for 2 years before I decided this is not teaching is not what I want to do. I want to do something else, and programming was that thing. And so I certainly understand kind of where you're coming from. I'm guessing most of you are like career switchers, right? Probably coming in from another industry into programming. Is that fair? Is that accurate? That was me in 2010, and it worked out very well from a personal standpoint as well as a professional one. So I carry that with me in all the work I do in my classes and demos as well. So if you're interested in any of my classes, I deliver that mentality very strongly in all my work. So my next weekend demo is this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, 10 to 6, and then we do monthly classes, Tuesdays, Thursdays, 6 to 9 p.m. So tonight would have been like a typical class plus another half hour. So if you can bear another half hour, no, 6 to 9, yeah, no, another half hour, then that's one class. We do that twice a week. The next one starts January 5th, Tuesday, Thursday, the whole month of January, 4 weeks. That is $1,200, but it's $1,000 if you pay full tuition. So if you pay the deposit, which is $500, then your tuition is $1,200 on the back end. If you pay the whole thing, you get $200 discount. So that's what's coming up. And I will let you know about the other demos where I invite startups and whatnot, hiring people. I don't know. I've never done that before, so it'll be kind of new for me as well. I need to figure out a good format for those demos. But I do think there's good content for both sides of that equation. And if you're looking to make contacts and hopefully get a job, or just meet more people within the startup industry over the weekends on Saturdays and Sundays when I'm not doing the weekend workshops, I'll be doing that here as well. So the building is empty on weekends. So any questions?
Can I see the state?
Yeah, sure.
But I missed that part.
If you got everything working and you're set to go, you're free to leave. I'm not going to hold you hostage. But this code and the demo will be on my website tomorrow around this time.